Not everything that is happening in our country today can be traced to the globalist agenda. Some of it is just plain old greed and corruption. In the provinces of Ontario and Manitoba, there is a structure in place that enables title fraud, allowing criminals to steal properties from their rightful owners. In Ontario alone, this equals $300 million annually in stolen property through title fraud. Titles which the rightful owners have very little chance of ever getting back. In 2008, Martin McDermott, an expert in databases and electronics, became aware of the land title racket when his own mother's property was stolen. Since then, Martin has been deeply researching TerraNet, the privately owned land title corporation which handles all land transfers in Ontario and Manitoba. He has also been assisting the victims of title fraud and working to raise awareness of the issue. But of course, mainstream media has little interest in carrying the story. The lawyer who stole Mr. McDermott's mother's property is now under suspension, but even that may not result in justice, as under the rules of the Law Society, all of his records are now in their possession, and they won't share them. Martin joins me today with the full story on TerraNet, and more importantly, how you can protect yourself from having your land title stolen. Martin, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now you, as I said in the introduction, you've uncovered this whole scam for title fraud that's going in Ontario and in Manitoba. Before we get into specific instances, and you certainly have those to share with our viewers, I'd like you to give us a very brief overview of how this title fraud is being done.
Essentially, the electronic land registry system came online to lawyers in 2000. And all they had to do was make application because they were into real estate, or maybe not into real estate, but they had to make application to the TerraNet company to receive the credentials. All they had to be was a licensed lawyer with the Law Society of Upper Canada. That's the licensing agency of Ontario for lawyers. And they could receive a floppy diskette and a specially encrypted key-coded password, and they didn't need another lawyer to be representing a seller if they were representing the buyer, because they were representing both the buyer and the seller, and they were going to town and they were just transferring properties to themselves. And by 2005, the Law Society had 72 lawyers under investigation for multiple properties each. And they said to the TerraNet company, there's something that needs to be fixed in your system because you quadrupled mortgage fraud in the first year of operation. And now it's at $300 million a year.
Now, we are going to get into the specifics in a few minutes, but I know that you have instances of people you've dealt with, some people who you've helped out, people who have lost their properties, many of them elderly, had their properties stolen from them through these title frauds. Would you please give us some of those stories?
Okay, the ones that I had researched, just unbelievable because they went through the legal cases and they spent a whole lot of money trying to get their property back. They did everything right that they could. And then in the worst case, the lawyers at the end, they told the elderly lady, if this system isn't fixed at the legislative level, this will continue to happen. You see, so they got gypped by a crooked judge who didn't make the right ruling, because changing a land title back to an original owner after it's gone through two sales, they call that deferred title. So they've created all these mechanisms for people to lose their properties and no mechanism for anybody to get their property back. And so Trudy Trohan Upchan, she was the one who had fought this and probably spent the most, but her mother and her were evicted from their house because her father, and a brother had stolen the title and then transferred it to themselves, using a lawyer to do that. And matrimonial properties, I discovered, are the most stolen of titles.
So in this particular case, this was a divorce. She was living in the house, and he basically just stole it from her.
Not even a divorce, just a separation.
Just a separation.
And that's when she realized she didn't have an asset.
Right. Now, this also happened, not in that particular framework, but this happened to your own mother.
That's right. That's right. The fraudsters, I detected because I do data and I know what I'm talking about. The fraudsters need a dupe, and that's a lawyer. that will go onto the system and will transfer property. Now, the question is, when the Law Society does their investigations, is the lawyer duped or is the lawyer complicit? Well, the 2005 study asked that, and so did the media. But the media didn't cover the story very much, and it was just an internal report by the Law Society, and so it got buried. So nothing has changed other than a few lawyers have spoken about the problem, and they've been beaten down by the Law Society for even speaking about the problem.
Now, you said that this was investigated by the Law Society, and it was a report by them, and you said it was in response to the question of whether or not these lawyers were duped or they were complicit. What did they find?
That's right, and they were complicit. What I found in my investigation is that the threshold is somewhere between 10 and 15 titles stolen. And that's when they kick in the threshold and they say, okay, lawyer, you're coming in for a hearing. And then the lawyer avoids the hearing for as long as they possibly can. Sometimes they have a medical condition as well, that they can't get to the hearing. And so they delay and delay and delay. And while they're delaying, they're still able to transfer titles and property and steal, because the Teranet company won't remove the title access system from that lawyer until the director of titles tells them. So the director of titles is a government position. But when I wrote the Law Society asking if he works for the Law Society of Upper Canada, 2 days later, Robert Lapper, CEO of the Law Society of Upper Canada, resigns, because in the content of my email, I told him I have an AI software now available to catch these people. Okay, with my mother, the dupe was my brother-in-law. Okay, so the lawyer knew how to work the system because that law firm actually represented one of the founders of the system. So back in 2006, is when the system was in the hands of this particular lawyer, James W. Oliver. And he is the husband of Philomena Tassi, sitting MP, Member of Parliament, Philomena Tassi. And Philomena Tassi and my brother-in-law worked in the same high school together, and that was Bishop Tonos High School. She was a chaplain at that time, and my brother-in-law was a religion teacher. And my brother-in-law had a common house with my mother at one time, but at 2004, my mother could no longer live with this man and his family. He was abusive, verbally abusive, and so we did the right thing as a family, moved her out of the house into a safe place in a building called Ryerson Assisted Living, and she was happy until she had a medical condition, went in the hospital, and as we had discussed earlier, she got accidentally euthanized by some process called comfort measures.
Yes.
And my mom didn't have cancer, and she ended up dead without a land title as well.
Just subsequent to her death, you discovered that the title on that property had been transferred without her knowledge, without her signature. Please tell us what happened there.
Okay, so when we went to the land registry office, my mother died in December 2007. And in February, we're at the land registry office because my sister had suggested that she had bought my mother's house. And we know that my mother didn't have any money for that sale, that's for sure. And the power of attorney wouldn't have known anything, and nobody else knew anything. And she just started BSing us. And so we went down to the land registry office, ran the title in the new electronic land registry, and I got 3 pieces of paper printed out. I shook them in my hand. I said, well, what's this? I went up to the front counter, asked the lady, I said, what is this? And she says, oh, that's the land title document that you print. I said, okay, well, where are the supporting documents? And she says, oh, well, those are kept with the conveying attorney. You see, so the conveying lawyer keeps the documents in his office. And so I found out the whole system, researched it inside out, reverse engineered their software and their process for everybody to see how stupid it is, how absolutely stupid.
The lawyer who is doing the conveyancing is doing both sides of the transaction, buyer and seller. And he's the one who keeps the documents, the records of the transaction in his own private files. Those aren't at the Teranet land titles.
That's correct. The system is so cleverly thought out. You've got the electronic land titles, which is a database. And then you've got a process called E-Reg, E-Reg. And both of those things are patented. It's funny, actually, that they actually had to patent it before they sold it off to OMERS Pension Fund. That's the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System. And when they owned it, that's the Ontario Employees Retirement System, when they got to own it, they were now in a conflict of interest by owning our land registry software and system. As I said, okay, it's broken down into two things. The E-reg, just crumple it up and throw it over your shoulder, because you only need the software, and the software doesn't have any Sentinel on the top of it. Sentinel software is what you monitor people in and out of the software. It gives a timestamp, everything that they do, the duration, and then you know whether you're dealing with a real estate professional or a hack on the fly trying to do something shady. You see, AI software will sort that out.
Now, hang on a minute. I just need to verify that I understand what you just told me, because the entire land titles is being run through this, as we're going to get into the details in a few minutes, this private company, TerraNet. It's not run by the government. This applies to every property, every residential property in Ontario and Manitoba. And there's no Sentinel software monitoring who's monkeying with that data.
Nothing at all, nothing whatsoever. And this is what I complained to them about when I first wrote Agostino Russo, the chief legal officer, and Elgin Farwell, who is also interviewed by Princeton University. And so were some of the other founders, and they disclosed certain things that Americans would find reprehensible about what they said about our software and our system and their relationship to addressing the fraud issues. They don't have any way of addressing the fraud issues. And so every American who owns property in Canada, Ontario, Canada, or Manitoba, they have a higher risk than owning property in any other province. Because if you're out of the country, you're going to have a hell of a time finding a lawyer that will go up against one of these cartels that steals your house.
Now, I need a clarification on something, because I just said that it applies to all residential properties, but does it apply to commercial as well?
It applies to everything. There's another victim out in, the property was in Orillia, or just outside of Orillia, but the man lives in Orillia now. I've interviewed him regularly. He and his wife lost their house. They ended up evicted out of their house. He wrote the story up very well on the internet. I detected, oh yes, I know what this fraud is. I called him up and I've interviewed him, and I told him, in the way that he was being led away again by some lawyers, I'm going to watch you, mister. You have to know that these lawyers are leading you down a path, and so keep me informed. And so he's kept me somewhat informed, but I'm going to try and, keep in touch with him, because he has what I call a live case, because he already lost his house and his business, ran out of the house, and his intellectual property was what started it. You see, I discovered that he had intellectual property that got stolen first, and then it was his house, so that he couldn't fight back. All
right, Martin, we've given people a good overview. We've given them several cases, but of course, these are just representative, because as you said, we're talking about $300 million in property every year that's being subjected to this kind of fraud. Would you please now, let's get into the details of TerraNet and how they came to be, what they are, and how they're doing this.
What it was some people snooping around in the back rooms of the Ministry of Consumer and Commercial Relations starting around the mid-'80s, maybe a little bit earlier, possibly 83. The first guy was named Fred Khosravi. He was a friend of Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Prime Minister John Chrétien, Prime Minister Paul Martin, and a whole number of other Liberal people. So we identified that he was a big proponent of getting closer ties between the Liberal government federally and the Liberal government provincially in Ontario. And he advocated for that kind of camaraderie. But at the same time, he had come into the country in 1966 from Iran. And he became an insurance salesman, but he also sold, I understand, Massey Ferguson tractors in Iran. And he was the top Massey Ferguson salesman for the company, basically, internationally. He could have bought the company at one time. He wanted to buy the company, but that company, as you know, dismantled and shipped offshore. And so that's what happened to many manufacturing. But anyhow, Fred Khosravi was the beginning of this. And also, there was a Saudi Arabian that was allegedly had the money, and his name was Mohammed Al-Kayzibak. And I've tried to contact him, and he will not return phone calls. So Mohammed Al-Kayzibak of Saudi Arabia now is apparently Mohammed Al-Kayzibak, Syrian-born. But I have his resume from Saudi Arabia.
We've got foreign interests who are creating a private company
to
handle land titles in the most populous province in our country. But it goes beyond that, because in the documents you sent me, there's also a reference to the Cayman Islands. And anybody who knows anything about the Cayman Islands knows this is a place where they very often launder money. So that set off alarm bells when I saw that.
Yeah, this is what happened is when Real Data Ontario set up the company, they set up Real Data Ontario Corporation, and then they set up Real Data Ontario. You see, so Real Data Ontario was the board that was a face with names and that, but Real Data Corporation didn't have any names or faces. And so it was under one name, and that was a guy named Eric Baker of Maralta. And so when I researched all of this, I found out that there was some investment that came in from a mining mogul, Eric Baker of Maralta and Terramira, and they bought in 1993. Okay, but the company that got the contract was in the back doors in the early 80s. Their first proposal they wrote to the government was in 1988, and it was to use a well-known figure, Philip Lapp. And Philip Lapp was a rocket scientist that did work on the Avro Arrow. So they hired a rocket scientist to sell this deal to the government, and he was the only credible face. And I've interviewed Paul Palango about that. I wanted to find out specifically how he understood what was going on in this deal when he was at the taping session of the Fifth Estate. And I've got documents from the Fifth Estate episode that I saw, and it's absolutely scandalous. They will never, ever play that episode of the Fifth Estate because it would be deemed racist.
Racist because the people who were originals who started this Terranet company are foreigners.
Foreigners,
Middle Easterners specifically. So of course that's racist.
And that's the saddest thing is that when I talked to Paul, he said this whole thing came up. And I said, oh, no. And he said, yes. He told me about the court case that he had won, and I was very happy about that. I told him that I will be following up because I am doing a book on the company, and I'm doing a documentary, and some people have said it should be a movie at a certain point. But I said it won't be a movie until we destroy the Bank of Nova Scotia down in South America.
Martin, I just want to sum up where we're at now, because this is very important, folks, for you to understand. If you live in Ontario or Manitoba, unlike other provinces in Canada, your land titles is not run by your government. It's run by Terranet, a private corporation that was established over 20 years ago by foreign interests, which has no oversight, and where any lawyer who knows how to work the system can steal a property from someone who's unsuspecting. Is that about it?
That's it, exactly. Sight unseen. And it's not just the title stone. You can have an easement put onto a property, an easement taken off of a property, like lose an easement, lose title to certain pieces of your sovereign property that you thought you had. But, your right to own it is not the same in Canada, Ontario, or Manitoba as it is in, say, for example, Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan, they don't have private transfer. You can't do that secretly. You can't do secret filing, as Trudy Trohan Upton says. You see, she understands what it is, but I say, no, it's called tampering on the electronic land registry system, and there's a law that prevents that, and that's called the Electronics Commerce Act 2000, and it came out in the same year that Terranet brought out their software to convey land titles. Right. It's an electronic commerce product, and it's supposed to be monitored in that way, and it's not monitored by any regulatory authority.
I watched one of your other interviews, and there are a few other interviews with Martin out there, but they are trying very hard to suppress this information. Mm-hmm. A lot of stuff that you've talked about that people will be hearing about for the very first time in this interview, but I was watching one of your other ones, and you were talking about another method they're using to steal titles, and that's to put liens on them without the knowledge of the owner. And then, of course, when they don't pay that bill that they put the lien on it for, they seize the property.
Exactly. And this is a case again, okay, where the CBC does stories. I've called up the CBC and say, hey, that's a great story again, but why don't you keep the pressure on the minister, and make the minister answer the questions? Instead, no. They contacted the ministry, but nobody was available by the time our story was able to run, you see. And that's what it is. They never actually get a minister on camera to talk about stolen land titles and property. And I've got emails from ministers initially that understood the problem. And that was Mario Sergio, Minister for Seniors under Kathleen Wynne's government. He understood it. And Kathleen Wynne sent me an email. She understood it and said it was Marie-France Lalonde who was responsible, the minister, MPP. Nope, she wouldn't pick up the phone and call me ever. So eventually, the only minister I ever spoke to was Lisa Thompson, MPP, did speak with me, and she spoke with Henry Wilmot, the 87-year-old real estate professional that tried to help out Thomas Acton, the Irish immigrant farmer who lost his 2 farms out in Oxford, and he helped him for years. And he even went up to the lawyers who were the criminals themselves and tried to confront them, and they set up court cases and finally stole the properties outright and the money that was held in court.
All right. So where I want to go now, before we finish up with telling people how they can protect themselves or where they can get more information, because obviously there's not much point in telling people this if we don't tell them what they can do. But I believe you've also spoken with people who are directly involved with Terranet and confirmed with them everything you've just told us.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I did go and interview the people in Brant County that work behind the land registry offices, and I asked if any of them had worked there before the system was digitized, and a couple of elderly ladies there had been there. And so I said, so what was it like when these guys came in? And they digitized the system, and they told me they made a lot of noise and racket upstairs. They were by no means professionals. They knew that. And they said it was a hell of a mess upstairs after they were done. But they didn't know anything of what they actually did up there. And so I said, oh, well, that's interesting, because I was wondering where all of the content of the folio books and other things would have went. And she said, oh, they went to the museum. I went to the museum, and the curator at the museum's next in command down, he told me the whole story. 2 guys pulled up with a white truck out front, asked these guys at the museum, do you want this stuff? They went to the back of the truck, opened up the door, and they saw the folio books and all of this other stuff that was the archives of our history, our book of life, so to say, was in that folio book in Brant County, and it was ready. It was going for the shredder. If these guys in the museum didn't say, well, yeah, we've got John Simcoe's writings in this museum. I think we would like that book too. Yeah, sure would. And so they took everything off the truck.
Okay, so thank you very much for bringing this to light. I know that you've been fighting this war for a long time. So please, let's finish up by telling people, A, how they can protect themselves, and especially if they have elderly parents who own a property, because they are very often the victims of this kind of fraud. B, where they can get more information.
Okay, first thing is, now that the land registry offices across the province have been shut down, all of them have been shut down. You cannot access them physically. You have to go through a lawyer. You have to get your documents printed. And then when you get those documents printed from a lawyer, as long as you do still own that title, you're on title and 100% owner and no sharing capacity, nothing's mortgaged on there, then you need what's called title insurance. And there's different companies now providing title insurance. I said title insurance is a fraud because you shouldn't have to insure something that you don't own. The Ontario government owns that data, stealing the money from the lenders. So the lenders aren't being careful enough, and that's why you need title insurance. You see, because they're not doing their due diligence, and they're losing money. So now you have to buy title insurance to insure data that you don't own. You see, it's so bizarre, but that's the only way that you can save yourself if somebody steals your property. There's no way to lock your property down in the system to prevent it from being stolen, because everybody's property is for sale in the system. And when I reverse engineered the process, I found the character flaw in the system of whoever developed it. And I said, this person needs to come to trial. You see, it's that serious, but we'll never find those people. We'll never bring them to trial. And right now, all you've got is the option to buy title insurance.
And I realize that that's not a perfect solution, but it is a level of protection. You can prove with that document, this belonged to me, I got the insurance on it. And then even if they still manage to steal it, you can file with the title insurance.
Yeah. Another one is like the liens, like we had mentioned. Okay, if you had a contractor friend, a contractor can put a contractor's lien on your property, and that property would have to be, that lien would have to be removed through that contractor. You see, there you've got some protection, and it would be cheaper than buying title insurance, just as a tip for people. If you have a friend who can put a lien on the property for a small amount, and then you know that your estate might have to clear that lien at the end of your life, but you haven't lost your house, and your estate isn't dealing with it like my mother's estate was dealing with it. It broke up the whole family.
Yeah,
you see.
Imagine so. Now, are there online resources where people can get more information or where they can contact you?
That you can go to get information. The Land Titles Assurance Fund is supposed to supply people with the information, and you do not need a lawyer to apply for that application for Land Titles Assurance Fund. But one person, the Director of Titles, specified in the Land Titles Act, 1990, an invention, Land Titles Act, they wrote the law for themselves, the people, and he is the one guy that blocks everybody in the Consumer Protection Act's Land Titles Assurance Fund, 2006. He blocks that. So everybody has to go to court and spend a lot more money on lawyers.
Wow.
And that's one guy, Jeffrey Lem.
And I would imagine another thing that people could do to protect themselves is in the event of any kind of work that's being done with the title to the property, under no circumstances should you have a lawyer who's handling both ends of the transaction.
Exactly. That's against the rules of the Law Society, even in the E-reg process. And yet they have always a little loophole that they write into their Law Society Act, you see, that compels the lawyers, but it doesn't matter. Again, 15 titles. And Ira Howard Greenspoon is one lawyer that they can look up. And he has a golf membership at Beverly Golf and Country Club and a golf membership at the Hamilton Golf and Country Club. And he gives well to his synagogue. And that's what caused him to get his $64,000 fine reduced to $15,000 because he donates time to his golf club and his synagogue.
Thank you so much for bringing this information to light. As I said, folks, Martin's been fighting this war for a long time, trying to raise this awareness. And I think an important takeaway from this, not just what we've told you if you're in Ontario or Manitoba, with how you can protect yourself against this kind of thing happening, but if Terranet ever tries to come to your province, you need to go to your MP, your MLA, and make sure, no, under no circumstances does that happen here. It is a wide open door to fraud.